Picture this, a country totally sealed off from the rest of the world for like 200 years, a feudal society, with samurai and shoguns. Now flash forward just 50 years, and that same country is a modern industrial powerhouse with its own global empire. Now, this isn't science fiction. This is the incredible, true story of Japan's Meiji Restoration, maybe one of the most mind-blowing, rapid-fire transformations in all of human history. So how on earth did this happen? Let's dive in and find out. So on the one hand, you've got Japan in 1633, basically pulling up the drawbridge and telling the rest of the world, don't call us, we'll call you. Then, in what feels like the blink of an eye, historically speaking, it's 1895, and this is a Japan with a modern army and navy, one that's already defeated China and is about to take on a major European power, Russia. So, how does a feudal, isolated nation pull off a transformation like that? And so fast? Well, the answer's kind of surprising. It was a revolution that came from the top.
All right, so to really get how this whole thing exploded, we first need to understand the pressure cooker that was Tokugawa Japan. For more than 250 years, this was the government in charge. And yeah, on the surface, things looked pretty calm. It was a long period of peace, for sure, but underneath all that, man, the tensions were just simmering, building and building, getting ready to blow.
The policy behind this isolation was called sakoku, which literally means something like chained country. And they meant it. For over 200 years, with just a couple of tiny exceptions, no foreigners could get in and no Japanese people could get out. Now, this created a really unique society for sure, but it also meant that while the West was having its industrial revolution, Japan was, it was falling dangerously behind. And society during this time? Whoa, it was incredibly rigid. Think of a pyramid. At the very, very top, you had a tiny elite, the shogun, the regional lords called daimyo, and of course the samurai. Altogether, they were maybe, 6% of the population, but they held all the power over everyone else. It didn't matter how smart or talented you were. Your entire life was decided the moment you were born. But a system that rigid can't last forever, and the cracks were definitely starting to show. You see, the samurai, the warrior class, they were paid in rice, a fixed amount. But as the economy changed, that just wasn't enough, and many of them became super poor. Their bosses, the daimyo lords, were drowning in debt themselves. And at the same time, you had this new merchant class that was getting really rich, but they had zero political power. It was a total mess. Throw in some major famines and peasant riots, and yeah, you've got a system that's just about to fall apart. Okay, so if all those internal problems were the dry kindling, the spark that lit the fire was the arrival of the Western powers. In 1853, the outside world didn't just knock politely on Japan's door. It showed up with cannons and threatened to blow the whole thing down. Now, Commodore Perry's arrival with his American fleet wasn't a total shock. Foreign ships had been poking around for decades. But the real wake-up call, that came about 10 years earlier, in 1842, when word reached Japan about what happened to China in the Opium War. They heard how Britain had just completely humbled this massive empire. And it was a terrifying realization for Japan's leaders. Our swords and traditional ways are no match for this new Western tech. So when Perry's steam-powered, smoke-belching black ships sailed right into Edo Bay, it was an absolute crisis. The message from the West was pretty blunt. It was basically, trade with us or else. This was not a negotiation between friends. It was gunboat diplomacy, pure and simple. Faced with cannons they couldn't possibly fight, the shogunate really had no choice. They signed what are now famously called the unequal treaties. And these treaties forced Japan to open its ports and, get this, even gave Westerners special legal rights on Japanese soil. For the shogun, this was a massive humiliation. It totally shattered his authority in the eyes of his own people. And that decision to give in to the foreigners, that was the final straw. It was like a dam breaking. All that pent-up frustration from the samurai, the merchants, the peasants, it all just came flooding out. This single act sparked a violent civil war that would bring a 250-year-old government crashing down and, surprisingly, put the emperor back in charge. And the movement had this incredibly powerful rallying cry, Sonno Joi. It's a simple two-part idea. First part, revere the emperor. Remember, the emperor had been just a figurehead for centuries, but now they were saying he's the real ruler. Second part, expel the barbarians. Basically, get the foreigners out. It was catchy, it was powerful, and it united a whole bunch of different people against the shogun. So, the country basically split in two. You had the Tokugawa shogunate, the old guard, desperately trying to cling to power. And then you had the rebels, the imperial loyalists.
These guys were mainly from a couple of powerful regions in the southwest, Satsuma and Shoshu. And these were smart, ambitious samurai who looked at the shogun's weakness and saw a golden opportunity. The war that followed, the Boshin War, was over shockingly fast. The imperial forces, who had been quicker to adopt more modern weapons and tactics, just steamrolled the shogun's armies. The really key moment, though, was when the shogun's capital city, Edo, which you know today as Tokyo, actually surrendered without a fight. That saved the city from being destroyed. And just like that, in a little over a year, centuries of shogunal rule were just over. So on January 3rd, 1868, it became official. The young Emperor Meiji formally declared that imperial power was restored. The Tokugawa shogunate was officially gone. This was it. A brand new era for Japan was dawning. Okay, but this is where the story gets really wild. Remember that slogan, "Expel the barbarian"? Well, the guys who won the war, they did the exact opposite. In one of the biggest plot twists in history, they realized that the only way to actually resist the West, to avoid being colonized, was to become like the West. And so they kicked off this absolutely radical revolution, not from the bottom up, but from the very top. Their new mission statement was laid out in something called the Charter Oath, and it was basically a complete rejection of the old feudal system. It talked about creating assemblies, bringing all the social classes together, and just breaking from the unjust customs of the past. But the real bombshell, the most revolutionary line, was the last one: knowledge shall be sought throughout the world. I mean, after 200 years of locking the doors, Japan was now throwing them wide open and actively hunting for Western ideas and tech. So, to get a sense of just how massive this change was, think about this. Under the shogun, Japan was this patchwork of over 300 little feudal domains, almost like mini countries. It was super fragmented. Then, almost overnight, the new government just got rid of them. All of them, and replaced them with 72 prefectures, all run by the central government in Tokyo. With that one bold move, they wiped out centuries of feudalism and created a modern, unified nation.
But what about the samurai, the very warriors who fought and won this war? Well, in another incredible twist, the new government systematically dismantled their entire class. First, they took away their salaries. Then, they created a new army made up of conscripted peasants, so the samurai lost their whole reason for being. And the final blow? They were forbidden from wearing their two swords in public, the ultimate status symbol. Just like that, the age of the samurai was over.
And you know what? In just a few decades, they did it. The Meiji leaders achieved their goal. Japan completely transformed itself and, crucially, avoided being colonized like so many of its neighbors. It was an absolutely stunning success. But it came at a very, very high price. The new motto for the nation was Fukoku Kyohei, enrich the country, strengthen the military. That was the whole game plan right there. The idea was simple. To be strong enough to stand up to the West, Japan needed a rich, industrial economy that could support a powerful, modern army and navy. Everything they did was about achieving that one goal. And the results were just staggering. I mean, look at coal production, which is basically the fuel of industrialization. In 1875, Japan's digging up about 500,000 metric tons. Fast forward to 1913, and that number has exploded to over 21 million. And you saw that same insane growth everywhere, in railways, in shipyards, in factories. But like I said, this progress had a dark side, a terrible cost. A lot of the now unemployed samurai felt betrayed, and they rose up in one last bloody and ultimately tragic rebellion. In the mad dash to modernize, thousands of priceless Buddhist temples and cultural treasures were destroyed. And this whole industrial miracle, it was paid for by crushing taxes levied on peasant farmers. They literally built the new Japan on their backs. Which brings us to a really tough question. The Meiji Restoration is, without a doubt, a story of incredible success. It's about a nation that remade itself against all odds to stay independent. But it's also a story of immense sacrifice and cultural loss. It makes you wonder, right? When a nation has to transform itself just to survive, what parts of its own soul, its own past, get lost forever? It's a reminder that progress is never simple. And the past, well, it never really goes away.